Why debt keeps growing and never really gets paid back. If it feels like debt is everywhere, you're not imagining it. Governments are in debt. Companies are in debt. Households are in debt. Even countries that appear wealthy owe enormous amounts of money. And every year, that debt seems to grow, not shrink. What's strange is that debt is often discussed as if it's temporary. As if one day it will be paid back and disappear. As if economies are simply going through a rough phase and will soon return to balance. But when you look at the data, something doesn't add up. Debt has been rising for decades. Not just in one country, but almost everywhere. And despite repeated promises to reduce it, it never really goes away. So the question is simple. Why does debt keep growing? And why does it almost never get fully paid back? To answer that, we need to rethink what debt actually is in modern economies. Most people think of debt the way they think about personal borrowing. You take a loan, you repay it, and eventually the balance goes to zero. That logic makes sense for individuals. But at the level of governments and entire economies, debt works very differently. In fact, modern economies are built on debt. Not in spite of it, but because of it. To see why, start with how money is created. In today's financial system, most money does not come from printing presses. It comes from lending. When a bank issues a loan, it creates new money. That money enters the economy as debt. The borrower now has money to spend, and the bank has a claim on future repayment. This means that for money to exist, debt must exist alongside it. When loans are repaid, money is effectively destroyed. When loans expand, the money supply grows. This creates a system where economic growth depends on expanding credit. Without new debt, there is less money circulating. And without enough money circulating, economic activity slows. This is the first reason debt never disappears. Eliminating debt would also eliminate the money supply that supports the economy. Now consider governments. Governments rarely operate without deficits. They spend more than they collect in taxes. To cover the gap, they borrow. This borrowing funds public services, infrastructure, healthcare, education, and social programs. It also supports economic stability during downturns. When a recession hits, tax revenue falls. Unemployment rises. Spending needs increase. If governments tried to balance their budgets during these periods, the economy would contract further. So instead, they borrow more. This stabilizes demand and prevents deeper collapse. As a result, government debt tends to grow over time, not because of irresponsibility, but because the system relies on it to function. Even during good economic times, debt rarely falls meaningfully. Why? Because reducing debt requires either higher taxes, lower spending, or faster economic growth. Each of these options comes with trade-offs that are politically and economically difficult. Raising taxes can slow growth and create public backlash. Cutting spending can reduce services and increase inequality. Relying on growth alone assumes conditions that rarely persist long enough to make a significant difference. So debt accumulates. Gradually. Predictably. Corporate debt follows a similar pattern. Companies borrow to invest. To expand. To acquire competitors. To buy back shares. Debt allows firms to grow faster than they could using profits alone. In a competitive market, companies that avoid debt often fall behind those that use it aggressively. Low interest rates encourage this behavior. When borrowing is cheap, taking on debt feels rational. As long as profits exceed interest costs, debt appears manageable. Over time, this becomes normalized. Debt stops being a temporary tool and becomes a permanent feature of corporate strategy. Household debt completes the picture. As wages stagnate and costs rise, households borrow to maintain living standards. Mortgages, student loans, credit cards, and personal loans fill the gap between income and expenses. What was once occasional borrowing becomes long-term dependency. In this environment, debt is not just common. It is necessary for participation in modern life. This creates a system where everyone depends on debt continuing to exist. Governments rely on it to function. Companies rely on it to compete. Households rely on it to survive. Banks rely on it to create money and earn profits. Removing debt from this system would cause it to collapse. This is why debt is rarely paid off in full. It is rolled over, refinanced, restructured, and expanded. Old debt is replaced with new debt. Balances change, but the overall level remains high or grows. Another reason debt persists is inflation. Inflation quietly reduces the real value of debt over time. When prices rise, the money used to repay debt becomes less valuable. From the borrower's perspective, this makes debt easier to manage. From the system's perspective, inflation acts as a pressure release valve. Rather than eliminating debt directly, economies allow inflation to erode it slowly. This is why moderate inflation is often tolerated or even welcomed by policymakers. It reduces the burden of debt without requiring painful austerity or defaults. Of course, this comes at a cost. Inflation reduces purchasing power. Savers lose value. Wages lag behind prices. But from a system-wide perspective, it is often seen as the least disruptive option. The idea of fully paying back national or global debt is therefore misleading. There is no final balance sheet where everything returns to zero. Instead, debt is managed, not eliminated. This does not mean debt is harmless. High debt levels create risks. They limit policy options. They increase vulnerability to shocks. They can lead to crises when confidence breaks down. But it does mean that debt is not a temporary failure of the system. It is a permanent feature of it. This helps explain why calls to just pay off the debt rarely lead to real change. Doing so would require shrinking the money supply, reducing economic activity, and accepting widespread disruption. Few societies are willing to make that trade. So debt continues. It grows. It shifts. It becomes normalized. For individuals, this can feel unsettling. People are taught that debt is something to avoid, something to escape. And at the personal level, that advice often makes sense. Excessive personal debt can be dangerous. But at the systemic level, the rules are different. Modern economies are designed to operate with debt, not without it. Understanding this does not make debt disappear. But it does change how we think about it. It explains why promises of debt-free futures rarely materialize. And it explains why the conversation about debt often feels disconnected from reality. Debt keeps growing because the system requires it. It never really gets paid back because paying it back would undermine the very structure that supports modern economies. Once you see this, the pattern becomes clear. Debt is not a temporary problem waiting to be solved. It is a permanent condition to be managed. And recognizing that is the first step toward understanding how the modern economy truly works.